Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're diving into a place most of us would never want to set foot in: abandoned hospitals. Think about it for a second. Hospitals are already heavy with emotion. They're places of life and death, where people take their first breath and sometimes their last. Imagine all of that energy trapped inside walls that are later left to rot. Long hallways, peeling paint, broken stretchers, still sitting in the corridors, charts left behind with names that no one remembers anymore. Now, picture wandering those halls after dark, with nothing but a flashlight and the sound of your own footsteps. It's not just unsettling, it's dangerous. Across Asia, abandoned hospitals are some of the most haunted places you can find, from Thailand to the Philippines. Stories of people who've dared to explore them at night almost always end the same way. They leave shaken, terrified, sometimes never quite the same again. Tonight, I'll be sharing two true stories. One, the first takes us deep into Thailand, where a group of urban explorers entered a hospital that locals had warned them about for years. A hospital with a reputation so dark that even security guards refused to go near it after sundown. The second comes from the Philippines, where a young nurse, curious about the abandoned facility she once trained in, decided to revisit it at night with friends. What she encountered inside still gives her nightmares to this day. Both of these stories are based on real events, passed down by people who lived through them, and after you hear them, you'll understand why locals say abandoned hospitals are never truly empty. So turn off the lights, settle in, and let's step into the first story. The first story takes us to central Thailand, to a small provincial town about 2 hours outside of Bangkok. The hospital at the center of this story had been shut down for more than 20 years. Locals called it cursed. They said it had been built on land with bad feng shui, and from the very beginning it was plagued with tragedy. Patients who should have recovered passed away suddenly. Equipment failed without explanation. Doctors quit within months of starting. By the late 1990s, the hospital closed its doors for good, and the building was left to decay. Over time, nature crept in. Trees pushed their way through the cracks, vines crawled up the walls, and windows shattered in storms. But what really cemented its reputation as haunted were the stories. A taxi driver swore he saw a woman in a white hospital gown waving for help at the second floor window late at night, but when he slowed down, there was no one there. A group of night watchmen once claimed they heard gurney wheels rolling down the hallway on their own, and more than one villager said they heard babies crying from the maternity ward, even though the place had been empty for decades. Most people in town avoided the hospital completely. Even during the day, they wouldn't go near it. But for a group of young urban explorers in 2012, that reputation was exactly what drew them in. There were 5 of them, 3 men and 2 women, all in their early 20s, all students from Bangkok, who had heard about the hospital online. They wanted to see it for themselves, film the experience, and prove they had the courage to spend a night there. They arrived just before sunset, driving up a cracked road lined with overgrown grass. The building loomed ahead, 5 stories tall, its paint faded to gray, its windows like empty eyes. The front doors were gone, replaced with a yawning black entrance. Already the air felt heavier, thicker, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Inside, the floors were littered with debris, broken tiles, scattered medical charts, even old IV stands rusting in the corners, their flashlights cut through the dust, illuminating faded posters on the walls, warning about tuberculosis and dengue fever. It felt like walking into a time capsule of disease and despair. At first, the group was excited, laughing nervously, filming themselves as they explored. They made their way through the reception area, past rows of broken plastic chairs, and into the wards where beds were still lined up against the walls. They joked about who would be brave enough to lie down in one, but no one actually did. As night fell, the mood began to change. The corridors seemed longer, the shadows thicker. Their laughter grew quieter. Around 10 p.m., they decided to set up camp in what used to be the maternity ward. It was on the 3rd floor, a large room with several smaller rooms branching off. They spread out their mats, opened some snacks, and tried to relax. That's when one of them, a guy named Ton, decided to take a photo. He aimed his camera down the hallway, joking that maybe he'd catch a ghost. When he looked at the screen, his smile faded. In the photo, at the far end of the hallway, was a figure, a woman in a hospital gown, her hair long and black, her face obscured in shadow. Dodi, the others crowded around. Osama laughed nervously, saying it was just a trick of the light. But when they shone their flashlights down the hall, it was empty. No one there. Still, the mood had shifted. The air felt colder. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. They decided to stick together as they continued exploring. On the fourth floor, they found the old operating rooms. Rusted surgical tables stood under broken ceiling lamps. The walls were stained, the smell of mildew stronger than ever. As they filmed, they began to hear faint sounds. The metallic clatter of instruments, the squeak of wheels, as if trolleys were being pushed down the hall. They froze, listening. The sounds grew louder, coming closer, until they were right outside the door. Tong yanked the door open, shining his light into the hallway. Nothing, just silence. But the moment he stepped back inside, the sound started again. This time inside the room with them, the metallic clink of tools being dropped onto a tray. They turned their flashlights toward the surgical table. He turned their flashlights toward the surgical table. For a split second, they saw it, a figure in a surgical mask, leaning over the table, hands moving quickly, as if preparing for an operation. Then it was gone. The table was empty. Panic spread through the group. One of the women, May, insisted they leave immediately, but the others argued that it was just their imagination, that they had come all this way and couldn't back out now. Reluctantly, they agreed to stay until midnight. Back in the maternity ward, they tried to calm themselves, but the atmosphere was suffocating. Around 11:30, May heard something, the sound of crying, soft, faint, like a newborn. She froze, her skin crawling. The others went quiet too. The sound grew louder, filling the room. They followed it to one of the smaller side rooms. Inside, the floor was littered with broken cribs. The crying was loud now, echoing off the walls. One of the guys, Liking, raised his flashlight and screamed. In one of the cribs, there was a baby, small, pale, its eyes shut tight, wailing in the dark. And standing over it was the same woman from the photo, her hair hanging over her face, her gown stained with something dark. She turned toward them slowly, and in that instant, they saw her eyes, empty sockets, black and hollow. The group bolted. They didn't care about their gear, their cameras, or their mats. They ran down the stairs, their footsteps echoing like gunshots. Behind them, the crying grew louder, turning into a chorus of wails that followed them floor after floor. By the time they reached the ground level, the sound was deafening. They burst out into the humid night air, sprinting to their car. They didn't stop until they were miles away, their hearts pounding, their breaths ragged. None of them spoke for a long time. When they finally did, they all agreed on one thing: they would never go back. Later, when they looked through their footage, most of it was blurry, the audio filled with static. But in one clip, just before they ran, they caught something chilling. A woman's Sid's voice, low and strained, whispering in Thai, "Don't sit, leave me here." The group never posted the full video. Only a few clips circulated online, but their story spread through forums and local gossip. Today, the hospital still stands, its windows shattered, its walls covered in graffiti. Locals continue to avoid it, saying the spirits inside grow restless at night, searching for anyone foolish enough to enter. The second story takes us to the Philippines, to an old provincial hospital just outside Manila. This one had a very different history. It was originally built in the 1950s and served as a charity hospital for decades. Thousands of people passed through its doors, many of them poor families who couldn't afford treatment anywhere else. It was always overcrowded, understaffed, and underfunded. By the early 2000s, it was shut down after a new modern hospital was built nearby. The old building was abandoned, left to rot in the tropical heat. Over time, the stories began. Locals said they heard screams at night, especially from the emergency ward. Taxi drivers avoided the street in front of the hospital, saying they sometimes saw figures standing in the road that vanished when headlights hit them. Families who lived nearby swore that shadows moved across the windows, even though the building was empty. Some even claimed that on stormy nights, the hospital lights flickered on by themselves, even though the power had been cut years ago. Our story comes from a woman named Arlene. She was in her late 20s, a nurse who had actually trained in that very hospital before it shut down. She remembered it well, the long crowded hallways, the patients packed into beds, 2 by 2, the sound of crying children echoing through the wards. Years later, when she was already working in Manila, she often drove past the old hospital on her way home. It always gave her chills, but also a strange pull, like the building wasn't done with her. One night, Some friends convinced her to explore it with them. They were curious, just like so many others who had heard the stories. Arlene hesitated. She knew firsthand how much suffering had taken place inside, but eventually she agreed. There were four of them in total, two women and two men. They brought flashlights, snacks, and even a Bluetooth speaker to play music, trying to keep the mood light. They entered through a side door, the hinges rusted and half broken. Inside, the air was damp, filled with the smell of mold and rot. The walls were stained with water damage, paint peeling like dead skin. Old medical charts littered the floor. In some corners, wheelchairs and gurneys still stood, rusted and broken. At first, it was almost fun. They laughed nervously, taking photos, joking about ghosts. Arlene led the way, pointing out rooms she remembered, the ER, the nurse's station, the operating room. But as they moved deeper, the atmosphere grew heavier, the laughter died down. They stopped in the pediatric ward. The rows of small metal beds still lined the walls, many with mattresses, blackened by mold. Stuffed animals, long rotted, lay forgotten in corners. The group grew quiet. Arlene couldn't help but remember the children she had cared for here, their cries, their fevers, their parents' desperation. She whispered a quick prayer under her breath. That's when one of the men, Carlo, noticed something. A wheelchair at the far end of the ward had moved. Just a little, a slow roll forward, even though the floor was flat. Everyone froze. They shone their flashlights at it. It was still now. No breeze, no slope, no explanation. Nervous laughter followed, but the unease was clear in their faces. They moved on, trying to shake it off. In the surgery wing, they found an old operating theater. The surgical lights above were rusted, but still hanging. The operating table was cracked but intact. The group took turns sitting in the doctor's chair, pretending to perform surgery, laughing again. But Arlene couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. She kept glancing at the door, half expecting someone to walk in. Then the Bluetooth speaker glitched. It had been playing light pop music, but suddenly the sound distorted, turning into static. And beneath the static, faintly, was something else. The steady beep of a heart monitor. Everyone froze. They looked at Arlene. She shook her head, whispering, "That's impossible." The hospital's power had been cut years ago. There was no way. The sound grew louder, echoing through the room. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Silence pressed in around them. They decided to head back downstairs, suddenly less eager to keep exploring. As they walked down the main corridor, they heard footsteps behind them, not their own. Heavier, slower. They turned, flashlights sweeping the hall. Empty, but the sound continued, closer and closer, until it seemed just a few steps behind. Panic set in. They hurried to the main lobby, trying to find their way out, but the layout seemed wrong now, twisted. Arlene swore they had taken this hallway before, but now it ended in a blank wall. They turned another corner and found themselves back in the pediatric ward. Even though they were sure they had gone in the opposite direction, it was as if the building was shifting, trapping them. That's when they heard it, the sound of children crying, not one, but many, echoing all around them. The sound was high-pitched, desperate, filling the air like a chorus. They clutched each other, terrified. Arlene raised her flashlight toward the beds. For a moment, she swore she saw them occupied. Small figures lying under the blankets, shifting, crying. One of them sat up slowly, its face pale and hollow, eyes dark sockets. The group screamed and bolted. They ran blindly through the corridors, not caring where they ended up, just desperate to escape. The crying followed them, rising in pitch, joined now by other sounds, gurney squeaking, doors slamming, whispers in Tagalog they couldn't understand. Finally, they burst through a side door into the humid night air, collapsing on the grass outside. The sound stopped instantly. Just silence, broken only by their own gasping breaths. They didn't look back. They got in their car and drove away, shaking, pale, their laughter gone. Later, Arlene admitted something. When she glanced back just once, against her better judgment, she saw figures watching from the windows of the pediatric ward, dozens of them. Children, nurses, patients, all staring silently as if waiting for them to return. She never went back to that hospital again, but even now, when she drives past, she refuses to look at the building. She says, if you give it attention, it notices you, and once it notices you, it never forgets. Stories like these are reminders that abandoned hospitals are never just empty buildings. They're filled with the memories of everyone who passed through them. In Asia especially, hospitals carry a deep spiritual weight. They're places of birth and death, of joy and grief, of hope and despair. When a hospital closes, those emotions don't simply vanish. They linger, absorbed by the walls, the beds, the objects left behind. In many Asian traditions, there's a belief that spirits tied to sudden or painful deaths have trouble moving on. Hospitals see more of these deaths than almost anywhere else. Patients who never got to say goodbye, mothers who lost children, families who couldn't afford treatment. All that pain accumulates, and when the building is finally abandoned, the spirits remain with no one left to hear their cries. That's why locals warn against visiting abandoned hospitals. In Thailand, people say hospitals are especially dangerous because of Phai Tai Hong, ghosts of those who died violent or untimely deaths. They are restless, angry, and sometimes vengeful. In the Philippines, they speak of molto, spirits who remain because their deaths left something unresolved. Many nurses and doctors believe these spirits linger in the wards where they took their last breath, still seeking care that will never come. And then there's the physical side. Hospitals are mazes, long corridors, repeating rooms, stairwells that look the same. Once inside, it's easy to get lost, easy to feel like the building itself is shifting around you. For those already frightened, the mind plays tricks. But as we've heard tonight, sometimes it isn't just the mind. Sometimes the sounds are too clear, the figures too distinct, the voices too close. Both stories we heard, the hospital in Thailand, where explorers heard the cries of infants and saw the woman in the stained gown, and the hospital in the Philippines, where Arlene and her friends found themselves trapped in looping corridors, showed the same pattern. These places are not abandoned. They are still alive, in a way, still occupied, still watching. Skeptics will say it's just fear amplifying natural sounds, rats moving furniture, wind whistling through broken windows, the echo of your own footsteps. But if you ask those who've gone in and come out pale and shaken, they'll tell you they felt something more, something personal, something that seemed to reach out and notice them. And once it notices you, that's when the real haunting begins. It's no coincidence that the most common experiences in abandoned hospitals are cries, footsteps, and voices. These are the sounds of life interrupted. A baby who never left the ward, a patient who never left the operating table, a nurse who still walks around even though the hospital has been closed for decades. For the living, those sounds are warnings, a reminder that these halls are not ours anymore. So, if you ever find yourself standing outside a crumbling hospital in Asia, weeds growing through the cracked pavement, windows dark and empty, think twice before you step inside. And if you do, remember this. Hospitals are places of beginnings and endings. You might walk in as a visitor, but you may not walk out the same. Because abandoned hospitals don't forget. They don't forgive. And sometimes they don't let you leave.